He ruled the most powerful empire on earth, and every night he wrote about death, because he knew Rome was already dying. Not war, not plague, not the borders, the death of the idea that a good man could hold it together. He wrote about that privately, in the dark, for 19 years, and nobody was supposed to read it. This is not a story about wisdom. This is a story about what wisdom costs, and who ends up paying. We read the Meditations, and we see a finished man, serene, resolved, at peace with power. That is not who wrote those pages. The man who wrote those pages was 50 years old, sick, sleeping in a military tent on the Danube frontier, watching his empire hemorrhage from a plague that had been killing people for a decade, commanding armies he had personally led for years, and still every night finding himself falling short of the standard he had set for himself at 17. He wasn't writing philosophy. He was writing reminders to himself for tomorrow morning, so he could get up and do it again. We consume Stoicism today as an aesthetic. Cold showers, discipline routines, morning pages. Marcus Aurelius invented none of that. He inherited a burning building and spent 19 years deciding every morning not to run. That's not a lifestyle. That's a sentence. And the first thing that made it a sentence, the thing that started before he even took the throne, walked into Rome in 165 AD wearing a soldier's face. Roman soldiers came home from Parthia. They marched through the city gates with the faces of men who had won, and within weeks, the streets smelled like death. Not battle death, civilian death. Grandmothers, children, merchants, senators, 2,000 people a day at the peak. In Rome alone, the bodies were piling up faster than they could be burned. Whole neighborhoods went silent overnight. Farms abandoned mid-harvest. Ships docked with no one left to unload them. And the legions, the professional soldiers Marcus needed to hold a frontier that stretched from Scotland to Syria, were dying in their barracks. Imagine inheriting that. Your first years as emperor, your armies dissolving, your capital city a mass grave, and there is no one above you to call. Marcus did not retreat. He reorganized recruitment. He opened the legions to slaves, gladiators, and Germanic mercenaries, men who fought for money, not Rome. He knew what that meant. He did it anyway. He bought time with compromises he hated making. And at night, after the decisions and the reports and the death counts, he wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." He wasn't sharing that. He was arguing with himself, because some nights the argument was close, but the plague was only killing Rome on the inside. Something was pressing hard from the outside. The Marcomanni, the Quadi, 12 years. The Germanic tribes were not a nuisance. They were a structural test. They were probing whether the man running the empire had the same teeth as the empire that had been running itself for 2 centuries. Marcus went himself. He did not send a general. He left Rome, the libraries, the forum, the philosophers he had grown up with, and moved into a tent on the Danube. For 12 years. Picture it physically. The cold that does not leave your bones between October and April. The sound of a military camp at 4 in the morning, horses, iron, low voices of men who are afraid but will not say it. The smell of a river in winter. The weight of correspondence that never stops arriving. And somewhere in that tent, by lamplight, after all of it, a man in his mid-50s, slowly dying of an illness that never fully left him, writing, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." He did not write that because it was easy. He wrote it because he needed to believe it again, and again, and again. The Meditations repeat themselves constantly. That is not redundancy. That is a man who kept forgetting under pressure and had to reteach himself how to stand up. And then comes the contradiction that defines everything. Stoicism has one non-negotiable premise. You do not get to want outcomes. You only get to control your response. Marcus wrote about that obsessively. He also ran the most outcome-dependent institution in human history for 19 years and never stepped away from it. The emperors before him had separated the throne from the bloodline. Trajan adopted Hadrian. Hadrian adopted Antoninus. Antoninus adopted Marcus. None of them were biological sons. All were chosen because they were the best available option. That system produced the most stable stretch in Roman history. Marcus knew this. He had lived inside it. He wrote, Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one. And then he became the exception to the system that made him emperor. The man who could hold a plague, hold a war, hold a frontier, could not hold the line between what the empire needed and what he wanted for his family. Commodus was not a surprise. That is the fact that changes everything. Signs were visible: early cruelty in small moments, vanity, indifference to governance. Advisors warned Marcus. Contemporary sources record the concern. The evidence was not subtle. And Marcus, who had read every warning about hereditary power, who had watched 4 emperors avoid this exact trap, made his son co-emperor anyway. He said he hoped Commodus would grow into the role. The Meditations mention campaigns. They mention enemies. They never mention his wife or his children. That silence is heavy. So when the moment came to choose, when every rational faculty he had trained for 50 years pointed one direction, he chose the other. Not because he lacked discipline, because he was human. After 19 years of sacrifice, plague, war, sleepless winters, endless reports, he made one decision that was not about Rome. Most men would have done it too. He ruled himself perfectly. He failed once as a father, and history punished the empire. In 180 AD, Marcus Aurelius died on the Danube frontier, in the same kind of tent he had lived in for a decade. Within months, the German campaigns ended. The frontier he had bled to secure was abandoned. Peace was purchased with tribute. Advisors who challenged Commodus disappeared. Discipline softened. The empire did not collapse overnight, but the tension that Marcus had personally held in place began to release. The plague damage was permanent. The reliance on mercenaries was structural. The finances were strained in ways that could not be reversed quickly. Marcus had not solved these problems. He had postponed them. He was the dam, not the solution. And when the dam was gone, the water did not trickle. It surged, which changes how we read the Meditations. Every line about not fearing death was written while bodies filled Rome's streets. Every line about detachment was written by a man who never detached from power. Every line about doing your duty without expecting gratitude was written by someone who would never be relieved of his. These were not instructions from a master. They were survival notes from a man trying not to break. We read the Meditations and feel peace. What we are actually reading is the private record of a man under relentless pressure who kept choosing to stand up again. That is not calm. That is endurance. Marcus Aurelius did not fail. He lasted 19 years of plague, war, political strain, and a body that was steadily weakening. He lasted, and at the very end, he made one decision with his heart instead of his head. We call it a mistake because we measure outcomes. We do not measure cost. The cost of making every other decision correctly. For 19 years, alone, in the cold, he ruled himself perfectly. He failed once as a father, and history punished the empire. We call him the last good emperor. Maybe what we mean is the last man willing to pay the full price. And the first thing Commodus did was prove how expensive discipline really was.